Hello, good day everyone. Today we will be discussing Article 1156. In this article, we shall be discussing the remedies of creditors in real obligation. We will also be discussing what happens when the debtor is in delay and what happens when the debtor has promised the delivery to two or more creditors. If you have remembered, we have already discussed what is a real right and a personal right. Your personal right is to demand the fulfillment of an obligation. Your real right exists when the object or the subject matter or the prestation of the obligation has already been delivered to you, then that is what we call your real right. How do you obtain real right? Upon delivery of a certain thing. Now in Article 1165, we will be discussing real obligation and personal obligation. Again, ayaw kalibog what is a real right and a personal right, what is a real obligation, and what is a personal obligation. Now, there are two different kinds of obligation. We have real obligation and personal obligation. What then is a real obligation? Real obligation consists of obligation to give, ang paghatag. Real obligation is that in which the subject is a thing which the obligor must deliver to the obligee. Meaning, yan to ka sa MCOR, kay gusto ka mo palit og TV. Now, si MCOR, i-deliver sa imuho ang TV. That obligation is called real obligation, the obligation to give. What then is personal obligation? Personal obligation is your obligation to do or not to do. For example, you are a singer and you are invited to sing sa fiesta sa barangay Bagumbayan. That is your personal obligation. Your obligation to do or not to do. Personal obligation is that in which the subject is an act to be done or not to be done. So again, always remember the differences between real right and personal right and real obligation from personal obligation. Article 1165 states that when what is to be delivered is a determinate thing, the creditor, in addition to the right granted him by Article 1170, may compel the debtor to make the delivery. If the thing is indeterminate or generic, he may ask that the obligation be complied with at the expense of the debtor. If the obligor delays or has promised to deliver the same thing to two or more persons who do not have the same interest, he shall be responsible for any fortuitous event until he has effected the delivery. Let us digest this article. Article 1165 talks about the remedies of creditor in real obligation. Unsay pasabot ani? For example, nagpalit ko sa MCOR and MCOR has to deliver the TV to me. The act of MCOR is what we call real obligation. Nga naman, because MCOR has the obligation to give or to deliver a certain thing. Now, what if wala gi-deliver ni MCOR on time ang akong TV? Unsa man ang remedies nako as a creditor. But this time, we will talk about remedies of the creditor in real obligation kung ang butang nga iyang i-deliver is specific or determinate thing. Another example, I went to Toyota and I bought a Toyota Vios. Ingon ko akong gusto nga Toyota Vios kay kanang na-plate number LHE677. That is specific and a determinate thing because it is not just an ordinary Vios. Kailangan na siya plate number nga LHE677. Now, the obligation of Toyota is what we call a real obligation. That is obligation to give a specific or determinate thing. What if wala gi-deliver ni Toyota sa ako ang akong Toyota Vios nga na plate number LHE677? What now are my remedies as a creditor? What are the remedies available to me as a creditor? First, I can have specific performance. Pwede ko mayon kay Toyota nga ambi i-deliver karon dayon ang akong Toyota Vios. Pwede pod rescission or action to rescind. Unsay pasabot-an namin ko nga ay dili ko undangon nato ni. Pwede pod resolution or min ko i-cancel na lang na ang pagpalit nako og car. Or pwede pod nga ipa-deliver na ko na sa imuha pero bayari ko og damages. So what are damages? I've already given you a link so that you may be able to understand what are the damages that the court may award to a person entitled to receive damages. Let us take a look at this example. So our characters are S and B. So what are the remedies of B? Let us take a look at this. We have S who sells his piano to B for 20,000 pesos. So, ibaligyan ni S iyang piano kay B pila 20,000 pesos. If S refuses to comply, what are the remedies of B? We have specific performance. Ingno ni B, hoy S, ang binakumpiano, i-deliver na dre. Pwede pod rescission, pwede resolution, pwede pod specific performance, pwede rescission, pwede resolution with demand for the payment of damages. Now, what if ang akong ipa-deliver is a generic or an indeterminate thing? For example, I went to panadero. Ingon ko papalita ko aning cake be. I-deliver ugma sa office March 8, 2023. Here comes March 8, 2023, si panadero wala niya gi-deliver ang cake. Remember, it is a generic or indeterminate thing. Kung ang cake mawala, pwede ra niya ilisan og laing cake kay daghan man sila og cake didto. Generic man ang cake, indeterminate thing. What now are the remedies of the creditor in real obligation to give a cake? The first one is specific performance. Pwede ba si creditor, hoy panadero, wakoy labot kung ang inyong cake diha na panos. Daghan man mo cake, hatagi kog lahi nga cake. Pwede pod, ask that the obligation be complied with at the debtor's expense with a right to recover damages. So pwede siya mo ana nga, ambi ng cake ninyo diha, kay panos man kato kong gi-order, pero bayari ko ninyo og damages. Pwede pod ko mag-ask og resolution or specific performance with damages in either case. So pwede ko maingon, ay di na lang nako nadayon nun. Or pwede pod ko maingon nga, sige, delivery ko, but I also have the right to demand with damages. In either case, kung gusto ba kong specific performance or resolution. Lastly, a person na naagrabyado whenever there is an obligation, that person has the right to demand for payment of damages. Let us take a look at this example. So we have S and B. Si S na maligya og rice. Now, S obliges himself to deliver 50 sacks of rice for 50,000 pesos to B. So ni ana si B, palit ko ana imong rice be. Human 50 sacks. 50,000 ang presyo. Ana si B. Ingon si B, palihog kog deliver S karong March 7, 2023. Now here comes March 7, 2023. S did not deliver the sacks of rice. What are the remedies of B? B now may approach X. Pwede siyang maingon, X, papalita ko diha og 50 sacks of rice. Now, what if ang sacks of rice, ang 50 sacks of rice ni X cost 55,000? Pero niya na si B, hala, 50,000 raman to kung gibayad kay S. What are the remedies of B? B may get the excess of 5,000 pesos from S. That is what we call damages. X can now perform the obligation, which is supposedly the obligation of S, but S will bear the expense of damages. Since short si B sa sacks of rice, kay iyang giandam 50,000 ra. Niadto siya kay X kay wala na fulfill ni S ang iyang obligation to deliver 50 sacks of rice for 50,000 pesos. Ang excess nga 5,000 pesos asa kuhaon ni B didto kang X. Let us now go to Article 1166. It states that the obligation to give a determinate thing includes that of delivering all its accessions and accessories, even though they may not have been mentioned. We have already discussed accessions and accessories before, so always remember this. Ang obligation daw sa paghatag, ug unsa ang imong ihatag determinate thing, includes i-appeal daw dapat ang accessions ug ang accessory maskin pag wala niya mention. The obligation to give a determinate thing includes that of delivering all its accessions and accessories even though they may not have been mentioned. What are accessions? What are accessories? Let us take a look at this example. Unsay accession? Accessions are fruits of a thing or additions or improvements upon a thing. For example, I have a land. Kini nga land na siya'y balay, na siya'y punuan. Kung moingon ko nga na ako'y baligya parcel of land, kung naay mo palit sa akong land, the obligation to give a determinate thing includes that of delivering all its accessions, even though they may not have been mentioned. So, ningon ko nga, guys, na ako'y baligya parcel of land, basi gusto ninyo paliton. Then, naay niingon, sige, paliton na ko na attorney. I-appeal na ko ang accessions, masking wala ko niingon nga appeal sila. The obligation to give a determinate thing includes that of delivering its accessions, even though they may not have been mentioned. What are accessories? Accessories are things joined to or included with the principal thing for the latter's embellishment, better use, or completion. For example, nagpalit ka og balay, automatic appeal ang susi. That is what we call accessories because it will not function without the key. Nagpalit kag watch, of course, appeal ang bracelet sa watch. Nagpalit kag picture with frame, of course, appeal ang frame. These are what we call accessories. The obligation to give a determinate thing includes all of its accessories even though they may not have been mentioned. That is Article 1166. Let us now go to Article 1167. Article 1167 refers to an obligation to do, to perform an act or render a service. And it contemplates three situations. What are those? It contemplates as to what happens when the debtor fails to perform an obligation to do. An obligation to do is a personal obligation. What also happens if the debtor performs an obligation to do but contrary to the terms thereof? And what happens when the debtor performs an obligation to do but in a poor manner? For example, when the debtor fails to perform an obligation to do, say for example, you have the obligation to deliver the thing, unsa may pwede mabuhat ni creditor bahin ana. When the debtor performs an obligation to do but contrary to the terms thereof, so kung moingon ko nga buhati ko cabinet nga color red, what if wala nimo gipinturahan og red, gipinturahan nimo og blue, unsa may remedies ni creditor? And what if the debtor performs an obligation to do but in a poor manner? So when I ask you to make a chair, pero paglingkod nako nahugno ang chair, unsa may remedies nga pwede nako buhaton? That is Article 1167. When we say perform an act or render a service, this is what we call your personal obligation. What does Article 1167 states? Article 1167 states that if a person obliged to do something fails to do it, the same shall be executed at his cost. Okay? Unsay pasabot ani? If you're obliged to do something pero wa nimo gibuhat, it shall be executed at his cost. Buhato na pero ikaw ang mo bayad. This same rule shall be observed if he does it in contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Kung mali ang imong pagbuhat, it shall still be executed at your cost. Furthermore, it may be decreed that what has been poorly done be undone. So kung nagbuhat kag bangko nga maot man di ay og dali mahugno, the bangko must be undone and you have to redo it. That is Article 1167. What happens if the debtor fails to comply with his obligation? Unsa may mahitabo? The creditor has the right to, first, have the obligation performed by himself or by another unless personal considerations are involved at the debtor's expense. So for example, gipabuhat tika og bangko pero wa nimo gibuhat ang bangko, unsa man ako ang right as a creditor. Pwede ko moingon sa imuha nga, hoy, buhatan na akong bangko. Pwede pod nga ipabuhat na ko na sa lain ang bangko. Ang imong bangko diha 7,000, ang iyang bangko dito 8,000. Ipabuhat na ko na dito sa 8,000, ikaw makabayad sa 1,000. Unless personal considerations are involved. So for example, ang akong unang gi-orderan og bangko di na day kabuhat kay napungkol siya, well kana dili na siya. Pwede. If wala nimo gibuhat akong bangko, I can also recover damages. What are damages? Again, look at the link that I posted in your Google Classroom. In this case, what if now? In case the obligation is done in contravention of the terms or if the bangko is poorly done unsa man ang akong right as a creditor, it must be undone if it is still possible to undo what was done. So for example, nagpabuhat kog bangko, paglingkod nako ang bangko nahugno, it means it has been poorly done. Therefore, it must be undone. Pagbuhat og bagong bangko. Okay? It must be undone if it is still possible to do what was done. So for example, ma'am, kung di na pwede magbuhat og laing bangko, kay wala na kahoy available sa tibuok kalibutan, unsay remedy ni creditor? Recover damages. Actually, Article 1167 and Article 1166 states the effects of breach of obligation. So kung nakay obligation, wala nimo gitupad, that is what we call breach of obligation. Let us read 1167 again and 1168. If a person obliged to do something fails to do it, the same shall be executed at his cost. The same rule shall be observed if he does it in contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Furthermore, it may be decreed that what has been poorly done be undone. Article 1167 states that when the obligation consists in not doing and the obligor does what has been forbidden him, it shall also be undone at his expense. So si Article 1168 ingon siya, what if ang obligation ingon nga ayaw nagbuhata pero imong gibuhat, it shall be undone at your expense. 1167 and 1168 are two different obligations. 1167 is a positive personal obligation and 1168 is a negative personal obligation. Unsay kalahian nila? Positive personal obligation is an obligation to do, while negative personal obligation is an obligation not to do a certain thing. If the obligation is not purely personal, the obligation may be executed at the debtor's expense plus damages. But what if purely personal ang obligation? Like for example, ang mukanta, ang musayaw, ikaw gyud ang dapat mukanta, ikaw gyud ang dapat musayaw, you can only recover damages. Ma'am, nganong damages man lang ma'am? Because it is purely personal. You cannot demand specific performance. Purely personal. If imo nang ipugos, you will be guilty of involuntary servitude. Meaning, gipugos na nimo siya og pagpatrabaho. Muana ka, di dapat ma'am, in the first place, wala siya nisugot nga mukanta day siya or musayaw. Yes, tinuod na, dapat wa siya nisugot. That is why you can ask for damages. If the obligation is purely personal, it is considered breach when the debtor fails to perform the obligation or if the obligation is done in a poor manner in contravention of the obligation. So for example, gipakanta ka pero nagniyabag ka rito, gipasayaw ka pero hubog man di ka pagsayaw, therefore you are entitled to damages. Now what happens in a negative personal obligation? This is an obligation not to do a certain thing. Unsay remedy ni creditor? To have the prohibited thing undone at the expense of the debtor plus damages. And if it cannot be undone, you may ask for damages alone. Let us take a look at this example. So we have A who asked B to build his house. Yan na siya. B, buhati kong balay. Ingon si B. Okay kayo. So ana si A, mao niya kung gusto nga balay B ha. I want a house with 3 bedroom. Gusto po na akong kitchen nga ang size 5 by 4. Unya gusto ko nga akong cabinets must be all white. If B does not construct a house, so ingon si B, ay di lang na ako nabuhaton, pero nakabayad na si A. A may ask C at the expense of B. So muana dito si A, C, ikaw buhat sa akong balay. Akong gibayad kay B kay 70,000. Pila man ang pabuhat sa imong balay? Ana si C, ay 75,000 baya na. So, unsay buhaton ni A, didto niya paninglon ang 5,000 kang B. Now, mo ni siya mahitabo ha, if B does not construct a house, A may ask C at the expense of B. Unsay pasabot sa at the expense of B, ma'am? Si B na ang mo bayad kang C. Now, di ba ingon si A, gusto kong 3 ka bedroom. What happens kung isa ka bedroom ra ang gibuhat ni B? A may ask C at the expense of B. Pwede gihapon na ipabuhat ni A ngadto kay C pero kinsay mo bayad? Si B. Now what if ingon si A, gusto na ako akong kitchen 5x4, akong cabinets all white, pero ang iyang gipaint instead nga white, red, unsay mabuhat ni A? A may ask B that it be and done. So pwede maingon si A, huy B, usban na kay ingon ko white nganong red ang imong gipintura. What if may si B, ngidili ko uy, human naman ako buhat na. Unsay pwede remedy ni A? If B refuses, A may ask C at the expense of B. Maingon gihapon si A kay C, C, palihog ra kog pintura ani B, himoa og white, kinsay mo bayad? Si B. Another example kanang personal obligation. Ana si director, mamaligya kog ticket kay mag-concert si Selena Gomez. Now, si Selena Gomez na COVID, wala ka-attend. Yan ang director, ay, si Sarah na lang ang mag-concert. Is it possible? If the performance by another would be impossible or would result to be so different that the obligation could not be considered performed. So, dili na siya pwede, nga naman, lahi naman ang concert ni Selena Gomez, lahi na po ng concert ni Sarah. Remember that Selena Gomez is a Hollywood star and Sarah is a local artist. In this case, the only practical remedy of the director is indemnification for damages. Hoy Selena, nganong nagpasakit-sakit man ka, nga kahibalo man ka na kay concert, bayari ko. That is what we call personal obligation. Let us take a look at this one. What is an example now of a negative personal obligation? For example, we have A and B. A now, a very rich woman, wants to buy the land of B. A says, B, palito na ko na imong yuta. Ingon si B, okay kayo. Pero niya na si A, pero ayaw butang og pader ang kilid sa imong balay ha. Ingon si B, okay kayo. Now, days later, mo ni ang land, pero si B, gibutangan niya og pader, gibutangan niya og koral ang yuta nga gipalit ni A. What happens now? Should B construct a fence in violation of the agreement, A can bring an action to have the fence removed at the expense of B. So, mo na si A, hoy B, tanggalan na imong pader. Kinsay mo bayad sa pagpatanggal og pader? Of course, the fence to be removed at the expense of B. Si B ang mo bayad.